Okay, it's time to get started. Just for a review from last time, I wrote down some questions I think that Paul answered. I just have 9 questions, and to kind of help jog your memory because it's going to play into where we're going next in the text. Is it good for a married man to not touch his wife? What does Paul say? No. Right, it's not good, right? It's more appropriate that he has his own wife and fulfill her needs as he does, not having authority over his own wife. And vice versa for the wife as well, in verse 2 there. All right? Is it ever okay to abstain from sexual intercourse within marriage?
For a time, it's agreeable.
Yeah, for a time, it's agreeable for prayer, right? For spiritual purposes. Yeah, verse 5. According to Paul, if someone becomes a widow, they should consider staying single.
Yeah.
Yes. Yep. In verse 8, right? Paul says it might be easier. What should a widow or unmarried person do if they aren't able to have sexual control? Get married. Right. Verse 9. Should a married person seek to leave a marriage? No. Right. Outside of adultery, obviously, that's not really in play. He's not considering that. In verse 10. What if a married person leaves the marriage? What are they supposed to do?
Remain unmarried or reconciled.
Right, verse 11. Should a believing person leave an unbelieving spouse? No, verse 12 to 13. And should you stop your unbelieving spouse from leaving you? No, verse 15. In that scenario, right, could you get married to someone else? No, right? Verse 11. Going back to verse 11. So that's kind of the full extent. Remember I talked about last time, Paul is not dealing in this chapter with the things that Jesus taught on marriage. But he mentions them. He says, the Lord's teachings. And he mentions that all throughout this chapter. And full scope would be, Matthew chapter 5, Mark chapter 10, Matthew chapter 19, Luke 16. Those are Jesus' teaching on marriage. And Paul has that in full scope. And I think what Paul is meaning in that is, for one, Paul says, I'm not here to contradict Jesus' teaching on marriage, but I'm here to supplement, because I have the Spirit, what the Lord hadn't said about marriage. This is what he says now through the Spirit, through the Holy Spirit, through me. Paul's just a bearer of that message. All right, so that's kind of by way. Is the sound working?
Yeah.
Okay. Sweet. All right, thank you. All right, so let's read verse 17 through 24. This is what I told you are the general principle that the entire chapter is built on. Sandwiched right in the middle. It's kind of like it's the main point, and it's the main thing that he's been trying to get to.
Only as the Lord has assigned to each one, as God has called each, in this way let him walk. And so I direct in all the churches. Was any man called when he was already circumcised? He is not to become uncircumcised. Has anyone been called in uncircumcision? He is not to be circumcised. Circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing. But what matters is the keeping of the commandments of God. Each person is to remain in the state in which he was called. Were you called as a slave? Do not let it concern you. But if you are also able to become free, take advantage of that. For the one who was called in the Lord as a slave is the Lord's freed person. Likewise, the one who was called as free is Christ's slave. You were bought for a price. Do not become slaves of people. Brothers and sisters, each one is to remain with God in that condition in which he was called.
Okay, so Paul's general principle that he's been teaching through this chapter, and he will continue after this section, is to stay in the state in which you were called in when you were called by the Lord, right? Meaning, when you became a Christian, whatever life situation you were in, remain in that. Now, we're not talking about a sinful situation. Obviously, we saw that in chapter 6, right? Paul taught that sinful lifestyles had to be changed. Not to belabor the point, but chapter 6, really verse 7 through 11, if you look at verse 11, after he's listed those sinful lifestyles, he says, and some of you used to be like this, but you were washed, you were sanctified, and you were justified in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ and by the Spirit of God. You used to be those things, but you put those things away. So he's not talking about that in chapter 7. We're not talking about sinful lifestyles. We're just talking about the things in which he's talking about here. And the idea is that God's call in Christ, it transcends all divisions based on social issues. You know, social statuses, they don't really matter to the Lord. Now, that's not to say marriage is not important. It is. We'll say more about that in a moment. But what he's saying is Christianity can apply to every person's situation. Are you married? Stay married. You know, chapter 7, verse 10 and 11. Are you a Jew? You know, are you circumcised? Stay circumcised. You don't need to go get uncircumcised. Are you a Gentile? The uncircumcised. You don't need to go get circumcised. Stay uncircumcised. Verse 19. Are you a widow or a widower? Paul says back in verse 8, remain how you are, right? That stay where you are. Be like me, Paul says in 8 and 9. Are you a slave? You know, don't feel this spiritual need to free yourself from that. In verse 21, are you free? Don't bind yourself in slavery. And so the application to us is you can live out the gospel fuller wherever you are. Wherever state that you're called in, you can live that out as you are called. A Christian doesn't need to feel like he needs to change all his social status. You know, you don't need to, Jews, you don't need to be Gentiles. Gentiles, you don't need to be Jews. Slaves, you don't need to be free. You know, free men, you don't need to be slaves. This is excellent because if you think about before you were a Christian, think about who you were before you were a Christian. What was your identity like? You know, whatever your social status was, you're an American or some other nationality. You know, maybe you were a part of some club or social ranking, maybe an enslaved person. Now you have a relationship with God, and being a Christian transcends all other callings and backgrounds. You know, God doesn't care about all those things. It doesn't stop him from having a relationship with you. And I think that's what Paul is saying. So we don't need to be worried about trying to change in any way like that. Certainly if it's not a sinful situation. You know, verse 21, I think might be the best, I don't know about best, but, you know, just the most interesting to me example he uses of a slave, right? You know, being an enslaved man and a Christian, how difficult would that be? It could be. If the master was a Christian, it'd be a lot easier, right? And if he was a Christian who was caring for the needs of his brother, he'd be the best master you ever served, right? But if your master was not a Christian and he couldn't understand, you know, maybe he had strict rules like, no, you need to be here on Sunday in the field or at your task. You can't be going and worshiping. That'd be very difficult as a enslaved person. You may suffer more as a slave who was a Christian. And Paul says, you know, you seek your freedom because of that, right? If the opportunity is presented to you, by all means, you should take it. But you don't need to be exhausting yourself over this endeavor of trying to rid yourself of slavery because you think that that's going to bring you closer to God. He says, no, you're already close to God. You can be as close to God as you want as a slave. Yes, it will be more difficult, but God will work through that with you. And you can be close to God despite that state. And so, you know, I think that is a real important thing for us to to consider. Now, today's day and age, it's hard for us because we have an American slavery in our history, which was a bit different than what was going on during the Roman Empire. Certainly, it's not too far removed at all. But there was cases in which in Israel where you could bind yourself to someone. You could be enslaved, willingly go into slavery to pay a debt or to take some sum of money. And that happened a lot. But at any rate, right, I mean, it's an important thing that he writes about that I think we need to consider. And the fact that, what this country's history is with it. We looked down on groups of people, and I say we, I shouldn't say we. This nation looked down on true believers of Christ would not have done that because that is extra biblical. It is not found within the Bible at all. I might suggest to you it'd be interesting to think that a slave could very well be qualified to be an elder, whereas freed people, there would be numerous that were unqualified to be elders. Can you imagine that? And it's just an interesting thing. Now, it's possible to misapply the principle that Paul is teaching here in saying that it's okay to continue in some sinful condition. In fact, in 200 AD, a church father, kind of like a commentator, a church leader named Tertullian, he wrote that some people had used this text of Paul to claim that that they could continue in their making and manufacturing and selling of idols. Because they were an idol maker, like they made idols to sell for pagan religions, some of them became Christians. And so if you become a Christian and you sell idols, can you continue selling idols? Can you continue selling something that promotes idolatry? No, you can't do that. That's hypocritical, right? I mean, you're going to do something that would profess, to take the seat of God away from him. And so they were trying to apply this, say, well, we were called as idol makers. And when we were called, and Paul said in 1 Corinthians 7 that we need to just remain as we are. Isn't that interesting? People will continue to do that. They use that for marriages that were not right for an individual or two individuals that didn't have a right to be remarried. They'll say, well, when they were called, all of that kind of gets wiped from the books. No, that's not what Paul is saying. He is not talking about sinful relationships or sinful situations.
Do you think that what he is talking about is specific to the Corinthians here? Like this must have been something that they were struggling with?
Yes.
Specifically.
Yeah.
Wanting to change something to become holier.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And when you think about the dynamic in the group, right? We saw that, like such were some of you section kind of tells us there was many different types of people within this church. It was a conglomerate of Jew, Gentile, just all different walks of life and backgrounds, all had different serious struggles with sin, all those things mentioned there. So because of that, there was numerous different people who had different understandings and different viewpoints of what they should do in their lives and how that they should, live their lives to try to be holier. I can't get past what Paul says there, in verse verse 20, let each of you remain in the situation in which he was called, and talking about being focused on the Lord. Keeping God's commandments is what matters. The end of verse 19. That's what I was looking for. Keeping God's commandments is what matters. Running around in these situations. So, comments, questions from you all.
I was raised by kind of older generation parents, and they raised us like if you didn't get married and have kids, like there's something wrong with you. That's the way you was raised up. Well, now I'm raising kids in a generation where maybe they don't want to get married and have kids, or maybe they just want to get married but not have kids. And so I think that it's important that we stress this to them that like you said there at the end of verse 19, You know, as long as they're keeping the commandments of God, that's all that matters. And,
Yeah.
You know, you don't have to be married and have kids, you know. And so that's, me and Brooks talked about that several times.
Yeah.
You know, that, I was just kind of raised that way, like, you know, yeah, you are supposed to be married, you're supposed to have a family, like, that's the way that life goes. But now, things are kind of changing a little bit, and I think it's good to remind them that, hey, it's okay, you know, you don't have to do that just because that's what you think we want you to do or whatever.
Yeah, I agree. Good comment. Well, let's look at 25 to 28.
Now concerning virgins, I have no commandment from the Lord, yet I give judgment as one whom the Lord in his mercy has made trustworthy. I suppose, therefore, that this is good because of the present distress, and it is good for a man to remain as he is. Are you bound to a wife? You do not seek to be loose. Are you loose from a wife? Do not seek a wife. But even if you do marry, you have not sinned. And if a virgin marries, she is not sinned. Nevertheless, such will have trouble in the flesh, but I would spare you.
Okay, so a lot of challenges in this section. One, he says he gives an opinion, but it's inspired judgment, right? It's not a requirement. I think that's the idea that Paul is saying here. His opinion is worth something, though, right? He has the Spirit of God. He has a holy revealed word to him. His opinion is worth a lot more in your mind and yours, right? And so I also emphasize this isn't just Paul's hunches. This isn't just something that makes Paul feel good. He doesn't care about that. He's not concerned about making some sort of, you in the best situation that he wants for you. That's not Paul's thing. It's an inspired opinion. He says it in verse 25 concerning virgins. You know, no command here, but it's advisable by Paul to remain unmarried due to the present distress that he talks about in verse 26. Now, present distress. I'm always speculating, like commentators are as well, on what their distress was. They evidently had a distress. It is interesting. It's noted in Roman history in 51 AD, about the time of this writing, that there was a famine in the Roman Empire. Could very well been a famine. Similar language Jesus uses when Jesus describes the tribulation that was to come upon Jerusalem. Shirley mentioned that last Thursday night, right? Whatever it is some pressing matter that people are concerned about. Uncertain times, right? Do they not make us rethink our lives? I remember the recession that hit when I was a young kid. Dad, struggled with that. We watched our parents go through that. The COVID or some disease is going around. Troubling, distressing times transcends all ages. It ain't just for the Corinthians. It happens to us. It's happened in our lifetimes, and it'll continue to happen. So Paul has that in scope when he's giving these inspired judgments, inspired opinions. Are you bound to a wife in verse 27? I think what he means there is, are you engaged? Especially when you look down at verse 28. He says it's okay to stay engaged. You don't have to terminate it, but it might be better just to not get engaged at all. Second part of verse 27. To the engaged, if you do get married, it's not wrong. He's saying it may be better, though, that you hold off on the marriage. Get through these uncertain times. Paul's just giving some good judgments here as a father figure to the Corinthians. I think it's something that we need to consider if we're in those situations, because Paul has considered it himself and brought it to us. Any comments or questions about that section? All right, let's look at 29 to 35.
But I say this, brothers, the time has been shortened, so that from now on those who have wives should be as though they had none, and those who weep as though they did not weep, and those who rejoice as though they did not rejoice, and those who buy as though they did not possess, and those who use the world as though they did not make full use of it. for the present form of this world is passing away. But I want you to be free from concern. One who is unmarried is concerned about the things of the Lord, how he may please the Lord. But one who is married is concerned about the things of the world, how he may please his wife. And his interests are divided. The woman who is unmarried and the virgin is concerned about the things of the Lord, that she may be holy both in body and spirit. The one who is married is concerned about the things of this world, how she may please her husband. I say this for your own benefit, not to put a restraint on you, but to promote what is appropriate and to secure undistracted devotion to the Lord.
Okay, so the time has been shortened. You know, as a Christian, I want you to think back before you were a Christian and how you thought about the world and how you fit in it and your life, right? You become a Christian, it's a new perspective on everything. Suddenly, we see the world as it has a terminal illness, right? Before you're a Christian, you may not realize this world isn't going to last forever. Your world is not going to last forever, right? And if, you know, how would you act if you knew you had 10 years to live?
Probably make better choices and think things through.
Yeah. What if you had 6 days to live? Would you live different then? Yeah. Time changes our decision making. Suddenly, I'm not concerned about a 30-year loan on a house. I've only got 6 days to live. I don't care if I make that purchase or not, right? Maybe even 10 years I don't. You know, so putting this all in the larger picture of this chapter, a Christian doesn't need to bog their lives down with being concerned on all the trivial matters. Now, some of these things don't look trivial, do they? Look, whether or not you get married, that's a big deal, right? In its own right. I think that's the toughest pill to swallow in these examples he lists. So we may come back to this one. What about weeping from hard times? Will hard times end? I mean,
They might get better, but they're not going to end it.
right. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. And, you know, you think about, I thought about pain. You know, some people struggle with chronic pain, but some people struggle with pain for a little bit. It's real tough when you're going through the pain. But then, like, when you get out of that pain, you might remember it and have some stress about that later. You know, but it's not like going through it. You suffer through that, but then you get past that hardship. And then, like Shirley's saying, you eventually come on and you're going to go into other struggles, right? There'll be more to replace them. Paul is telling the Christians, let go of the past, for the time of hardships is very short in perspective. Your life is short compared to eternity. 100 years is a long time. I hope I don't live that long. But if I do get to live that long, you know, it's short in comparison to eternity. Rejoicing over things, the inverse of hardship. Rejoicing is great. It's beneficial in the moment, right? But once you get through that rejoicing, do you go through life thinking, oh, you remember how great it used to be? You remember that was so fun? You know, that's kind of depressing then to think about that. Paul says, no, go on. Quit focusing on that. Enjoy the moment, for sure. Enjoy the moment. Rejoice with those who rejoice, right? He'll write that in Philippians. But you know, enjoy the moment, but don't let your life be focused on all the good times you had. Focus on the good reward ahead. That might be our admonition there. And then certainly buying things. You think about that. He's talking about buying and selling there at the end. You know, be careful buying things and trying to accumulate a bunch of stuff. That's a useless endeavor. Think about what Jesus said. What does it profit a man if he gains the whole world, then loses his own soul? You know, I wonder in my life, what will my last transaction be? What was my last business dealing going to be, you know, before I die? And then I die, and then I look back. Will I even care? Will it even matter? Will it be a couple gallons at the gas pump? Will it be a shiny ring or a nice watch or a nice car? The Christian has greater things ahead. Who cares? Those things don't matter. We get all up in a tizzy about those things. All those things will come to the end. eternity is longer, and that puts it in perspective. And so I think the application we can make is what Dennis already talked to us about this morning, is this idea of the American dream. You know, the Christian dream needs to be our focus. You know, our children need to be helped and coached through this. It's funny, as two dads, me and Dennis read this text and came away with the same understanding, the same thought. You know, college or no college. People get upset about that, concerned about that. I'm not saying those things aren't important and they shouldn't be considered, but should that be the main focus in our kids' lives? Marriage or no marriage? You know, what job were they going to get? Buy their house before they're 30. I remember hearing that all growing up, that if that's a mark of success. Having children. The most important thing we need to focus on is the Lord. And so Paul deals primarily in this chapter about things that aren't really sin, not really sinful lifestyles are in focus here. But in your life, the decisions you make need to be from the 1,000-foot view, right, of eternity. Pull it out, look at it. He says the world is passing away. Look for the things that last. Comments, questions about that?
What does last in this world other than God and eternity? What thing in this world is eternal?
Faith, hope, and love, but the greatest of these is love. Love never fails. It is eternal. Think about that. The love that God has for us is eternal. His promises are eternal. Yeah. Those things. And so, sorry, go ahead.
Let's talk about material. But
Do-
I mean, like, I think there's a lot of comments about like the stock market now.
Yeah.
I mean, does it last? It's not going to last.
Yeah.
You know, this world ain't going to last.
And it's unfortunate we've seen people, you know, when the stock market crashed back in the early century, 1920s or whatever it was, the businessmen that committed suicide over that because their entire lives were wrapped up and invested in the stocks. Yeah. Rob.
You know, I think it's kind of funny in this life how the more wealthy you are, the more children you have, the bigger family that you have.
Yeah.
I know as the Steels, you know, are such a large family and everything, but if you only have one or two people in a family, you really don't have that much to lose.
Yeah.
If you only have $2, you really don't have much to lose. And I think as humans that we do get way too involved in not only in material things, but even in our concerns. Well, it's a fine line between being too concerned about our the people in our lives and not concerned enough. But you know, we know we're going to lose the people that we love eventually, or they're going to lose us. And it's kind of bittersweet that the more you have, the more pain that you're going to go through in this life.
Yeah. Job's a good example of that. It wouldn't have been near as bad for Job if he didn't have a lot to lose.
The more blessed that you are, the more cursed you can become as far as this life goes. You know?
Yeah, and I think that's why Paul in verse 32 to 34 is talking about celibacy. He's saying it may be a better fit for the Christian in the idea that there'll be less hindrances, like the accumulation of stuff and family and wealth and marriages. And, you know, celibacy is not to be looked down on, but it is so often. You know, I often hear churches looking for a new preacher, and they want the preacher, they want the man that has a family, and he has children and a loving wife. And why are we seeking that? You know, it's funny to me, Paul would not have fit that mold. Paul would have had a hard time to find preaching work in America today if you didn't know his background and credentials, right? We need to be careful when we're giving our children advice and how that they need to live. Base it on Bible principles, not in the way that we think and envision they should live. Allow them to make those decisions. If they choose to be single, they need to know the danger in sexual immorality and being tempted in that way. If they want to be married, they need to know the dangers involved with the binding themselves to another person. It's going to hinder them in certain ways. Both will be hindered. And so we've got to teach that to them. But yeah, celibacy being looked down on, it's something I remember from my youth. There was a person I grew up with, and they chose not to marry. And as a kid, I'm ashamed to say that we kind of always wondered what was wrong with that person, you know. That person's still single and they're happy and they're a Christian, they're serving the Lord. I mean, they've actually been a pretty strong influence in their congregation that they're in because of it. And it's hard for me to walk away from chapter 7 and think that Paul is saying the married people are the victors in this chapter over the celibate. But I know that Paul is saying neither are better than one or the other, right? Both have their strong suits. And so we've got to be careful in playing matchmaker. We've got to be careful in what we advise young people to do, and older people as well. I mean, there's not an age that's listed in this chapter. I think he's got the full scope of all people, widows to virgins, in here. Okay, let's look then at 36 through 38.
That if anyone thinks that he is acting dishonorably toward this virgin, if she is past her youth and it ought to be so, let him do what he wishes. He is not sinning, let them marry. But the one who stands firm in his heart, if he is not under constraint, but has authority over his own will, and has decided this in his own heart, to keep his own virgin, he will do well. So then both the one who gives his own virgin in marriage does well, and the one who does not give her in marriage will do better.
Okay, so there's some textual concern for this passage as well. And I really do not have an axe to grind here. I don't care which way you read this or how you take this. I just want you to read this based upon your translation and look out there for other translations to try to get a better picture understanding. He's making a couple statements about engaged couples. Should they marry or should they not? Concerning all the things he's talked about, right? The present tribulation and then all the other things. Even going back to verse 25, talking about virgins there, right? Should they marry or not? Remember Jewish engagements from extra Bible text, right? Just some history about the Jewish nation. They were longer engagements because they were made oftentimes at children in their youth by both parents, okay? And they were binding agreements. They were oftentimes, most cases were as binding as the marriage itself. They were not married though. The marriage was not consummated. There was no ceremony. They were not married in any sense. It is an engagement. But in the Jewish culture and faith, it was pretty binding. Usually made young, and then the marriage would happen when they got old enough. Now, the question arrives in verse 36 over who is the he. Commentators are all over the place, but Greek scholars today have all conclusively agreed on this. There's only one or two that don't agree completely. The NIV, ESV, and CSB and others, I'm not going to list them all, they all translate that the man that is being talked about in verse 36 is the groom. The New American Standard, King James Version, New King James, and others write it in such a way that verse 36 is talking about the father. The word for father isn't used in the Greek. It's very, very vague what Paul writes in true Greek. In the latter part of verse 36, it says, let them marry. That word is gameo, And it is the word marry, marriage, take a wife. It's used about 28 times in the New Testament. In the word gameo, that is all that is listed there at the end. The word marriage, to be married. Allow them. It's a marriage in the affirmative, saying marriage can take place. Allow them to marry is not in there. Them has been added. They can get married, like what the CSB is up here. They is not in that word. It's just marriage in the affirmative. I'm only presenting this to you because a lot of times people will look at this as biblical text saying, see, the father must give the daughter away in marriage. I'm standing here before you, and you could certainly prove me wrong. There's no text in the Bible that says the father is to give, by God's command, the daughter away in marriage. That is a Western, not just a Western. It was also common in theirs, right? I just told you about arranged marriages. The families would, the mothers and fathers would put their kids together. That is a Western culture idea. It's also in other parts of the world as well. But that is a man-made tradition. That is not something that God has given us a direct command on or an inferred command. And so in application of this, Paul is continuing to give his inspired opinion. And I think we need to kind of switch gears here for a second and then open the grounds for comments. We need to be careful when we give our opinion to other people. I think we do that. I do that way too often. And I'm not even inspired. People do not have to do things my way in their lives. Now, if it's something sinful and we're trying to point that out, by all means, that's different. But as in these cases Paul is presenting, we cannot enforce people to do or live in ways that just make us happy. Some of the things that Paul talks about here are very specific, right? And they are binding. And I would tell people that this is what the Lord has commanded on it. But when it comes to being celibate or getting married, all those things, and how that they do that marriage and what that ceremony looks like, a lot of those things come to my mind. And what I'm trying to say is be very careful about giving my opinion and what it needs to be and how it needs to look like, especially when God has not made a command about that. Comments, questions, does that make sense?
Why would you want to keep her as his fiance if you didn't want to marry her?
It may be,
You know?
I see it. It may be that the present tribulation facing them, it'd be more difficult for them to get married and be together, especially if there was a family. There's more mouths to feed to start a family at that
What I'm
time.
thinking is they'll just keep on being, engaged.
Yeah,
No action taking place, either way. So which I don't understand why they would even want to still be engaged. Go your way, I'll go my way.
yeah,
Find somebody else,
yeah. I don't know. I wonder.
It's almost binding on something that they don't want to be in,
Yeah,
if you're gonna say that.
right. Yeah. I don't know, but I think Paul is just saying here, if that's what you want to do, if you don't want to be married, then don't get married. Yeah. And it's not a sin if you do get married. All right, let's look at 39 and 40 and we'll finish this up.
A wife is bound by law as long as her husband lives, but if her husband dies, she is at liberty to be married to whom she wishes only in the Lord. But she is happier if she remains as she is according to my judgment. And I think I also have the spirit of God. Okay,
so a wife whose husband dies, she has the right to remarry. Some things there, that just drawing from the teachings of Jesus and then some other inspired, Paul writing that point blank for us. But if he is living, she's bound to him. And so she, in that first part of it, right, she's got to stay with him. He's still alive or remain unmarried, like what it says back in verse 10. Now, if their husband does die, she's free to be married to anyone she wants only in the Lord. Now, What does only in the Lord mean? What he means is she is free to marry someone who has the right to marry, right in the Lord, right? She couldn't marry a divorced person who didn't have a right to be divorced. Only in the Lord means only in accordance with the Lord. Not a person who's in accordance with the Lord, but a person who has the right to be married. The marriage has to be right before the Lord. Now, this phrase, marrying only in the Lord, that only in the Lord is like what Paul wrote in Ephesians chapter 6. You remember what he said, only in the Lord, before I tell you? Obey your parents in the Lord. What does that mean? Does that mean only obey your parents if they're Christians? No. What does it mean?
As long as it doesn't go against God's law.
Exactly. So only marry someone in the Lord if that marriage doesn't go against God's law. That's all that means. That's all that Paul meant. And it doesn't mean we only obey parents who are Christians. We only obey parents who give, us tasks to do that don't go against God's word, against his law. Rob.
I just will say that makes a lot more sense than the way I've always understood it to be, because before I thought to myself that it appears to be saying it's okay if you marry an unbeliever the first time, but then the second time you have to marry a Christian.
Right.
And I thought that was kind of odd.
Yep. A big argument comes from 2 Corinthians chapter 6. I won't get too in depth with it because we're going to be in there later in the year. Paul says, don't join in with an unbeliever. A lot of times that's quoted with this passage. To my estimation, and a lot of commentaries I've read agree, Paul is talking in that chapter about not joining in sinful things. Marriage with a non-believer is not in the scope. Can you eat dinner with an unbeliever? 1 Corinthians 10 says, yes, you can. Can you have an unbeliever in your worship assembly? Yeah, 1 Corinthians 14 says you can. Can you be married to an unbeliever? 1 Corinthians 7 earlier in the chapter and here says so. Can you join in sin with a non-believer? No. 2 Corinthians chapter 6 says no, you cannot enter in, right? I might preface that by saying, what if I was going to marry an unbeliever and they wanted me to commit sin with them? I can't do that, right? What if they said, in this marriage, we're going to be married to another person. There'll be 3 of us. Could you enter in that marriage? No, you couldn't enter in that marriage. That's not only in the Lord. It goes against his law. That's what Paul's talking about. I have a hard time reconciling Paul's words to the Christian married to the non-believer in verse 17, as Robin was talking about, for the unbelieving husband and wife sanctified by the believing husband and wife, right? And then suggesting that taking an unbeliever as a spouse is sinful. I would never say that it's wise to marry a non-believer. That's not what I'm saying. It's not that I would not give some advice about that. I know each of you would as well. But I would certainly never say it's sinful. It is not. And then he says in verse 40, my opinion, but I have the Spirit of God. Paul is not shooting from the hip on these things. All right? Paul didn't just say, yeah, that sounds pretty good. No. God's full work, his full law and vision is in this. He has calculated the full scope of the word of the Lord on this subject. Anything, comments, questions? Pretty clear. That's a hard chapter. It's a hard chapter in his word. Okay. Well, I appreciate it. That's just God's word. That's not me. It's a chapter that takes some study. It takes some more study and some meditation on it to really look at. We got to be real careful in giving God's judgment on things. And I think people have done that in chapter 7 a lot when they shouldn't. All right, we'll take a short break.